Okay. Oh, just want to thank the team leading this morning. I tell you what, as I worshipped with you, with them, I just felt like those songs really just led us through God's truth and God's power. So thank you. This morning, we are going to be continuing in that series of grace that we started. And we've looked at, in the past, just to bring you to where we're up to, we've looked at that we know that as Christians, we've got a great deal. And I remember there was a line in that song, and I wrote it down quickly. The King of Kings calls me his own. We have a great deal. And although we don't deserve it, God has extended his grace to us. And we've looked at, in week 1, we looked at God's grace is more than forgiveness, that it also teaches us how to live. And then in the second one, we looked at that grace is able to teach us a new way to live, but we need to position ourselves to work and to learn in humble submission. So those were the first 2, and here we are at week 3. It made me think about this humble submission. It made me think about a conversation I had with my grandson a couple of weeks ago. So Naomi's been away, and I've been looking after my grandson during the day. And it's been tough in that first week because I had to go from the sweet grandma who did all the good things and hung out with him, and now I was the one who expected him to eat up his dinner and go to bed on time and be nice to people and have a bath and stop doing that and don't pull the cat's tail and would you like that if I did that to you? And he hasn't liked it. I haven't liked it either, but anyway. He didn't like having to submit to this new role I had. He didn't like having to submit to the authority, and because of that, that meant that sometimes I had to discipline him. And because of that discipline, we've had some interesting conversations. He continues to assure me that he is a good boy and he wants to do what is right. But Grandma, my brain just keeps telling me to do the wrong thing. And even at his young age of 4, I see him resisting what he knows to be right and engaging in that familiar battle with pride, when pride gets in the way and I'm going to do it my way rather than do it the good way or do it the godly way. And just like my grandson wanting to be good, we too want to live godly lives, but at times, aren't we our own worst enemy? At those times when pride digs in and insists on taking the high position, I'll do it my way, and we won't listen any other way. And it's at such times that I think we need to take a reality check. And rather than taking the high road, it's time that we get the lowdown on God's grace, which is this verse: God resists the proud, but give grace to the humble. And we see that here in Proverbs 3:34. It's also in James and in Peter. In this verse, we already know that God gives us grace. That's no news to us. But what we learn from this verse, there's some other very interesting things we can learn from this one little verse. We learn that there is a link between humility and grace. We learn that God withholds grace from a certain type of people, the proud. And we learn that God gives grace to a certain type of people, the humble. And in other words, the enemy of God's grace is human pride. It's like it puts a wall up between us and God's grace. And if you're thinking, oh, this information applies to non-believers who are resisting God, I want you to know that in those other verses, in James and in Peter, they were quoting those verses speaking to believers. Grace works in many ways in our lives, but when the Father sees his children willing to take that low position in the family of God, he pours out a special portion of grace to strengthen us in service to one another. Humility draws the blessing of God. You got that? Humility draws the blessing of God. Scripture says we are being transformed into his likeness. And in this conversation I had with my son between good and bad and wanting to be like God, I explained to him that the way to help him with his brain telling him the wrong thing, telling him the bad things, was that he needed to ask God to be his master. I just simply said, the way that you can get help with that, the only way you can get help is when you ask God to be your master. And just like in a normal conversation, he says, God, will you be my master? And we've had some great conversations out of that. As God teaches a new way to live, he sets an example. And I wonder, are you all in? I wonder, are you seeking to follow him as your master, understanding that Jesus has set the ultimate example to taking the low position, the Almighty God becoming flesh and serving that which he created. When Jesus came, he taught us how to be humble. And on 4 separate occasions, he said these words: the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And each of the passages where he said it, they're unique. It's not the same story being told over and over. There's unique teaching in each of the passages. And in that teaching, it teaches us to lay aside what we need to lay aside in order to humble ourselves. And we're going to look briefly at the teaching in these 4 different passages. What I will do is, I'm not going to read all of them, I'm going to read some of them, but I'm putting them up and I'm going to ask you to take note of them and to go home and have a look at them yourself. Some of them you'll be aware of the story already because they're common stories. So the first one is in Matthew 18, 1-4. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever becomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." He teaches us to lay aside dreams of greatness and embrace dreams of dependency. He says that whoever takes the lowly position and becomes like a child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This is a submissive and a dependent position requiring God's intervention every moment of the day. When you find yourself struggling, sometimes when you recognize you're in some disagreement, for example, and you recognize that you're holding on, you recognize that there's an attitude in you, but you're going to hold on to what you think is right. it is at those times that you need to recognize what that is that's at work in you. Are you in that position? Are you feeling those things because you are struggling, because you want your own way and are resisting God's way? If we look at Matthew 23, 1-12, in this passage, it tells us about the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, and they're doing everything so that they can be seen by others. They're dressing certain ways, they're speaking certain ways so that they can be seen by others. And Jesus teaches us to lay aside the thrill of recognition and find the joy of serving. In verse 11, he says, "The greatest among you will be your servant." I wonder if we can recognize in ourselves times that we strive for recognition. You know, when those thoughts go on and you're wondering why nobody's noticed. Maybe there's ways we do this in the way we dress. Maybe it's we want to be recognized for what we do or what we know. Maybe we strive for recognition by the titles that we hold. Jesus, however, teaches us that our example is one of a humble servant whose focus is not on themselves, but on doing the master's business. Let me remind you, though, that what we do doesn't go unnoticed. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reveals the Father is the one who sees in secret. He sees what's going on. In Luke 14, 7-14, he teaches, lay aside the thirst for honor from others and seek to lay aside the thirst for honor from others and seek to honor others instead of yourself. This is a parable about the person who goes to the wedding feast, and Jesus teaches them that they need to have a modest view of their importance. He teaches to not put ourselves in places of honor, but rather to take the lowest place. Are there times that we seek honor for ourselves? But not only does he teach that, but he also teaches honor those who can't repay us. It's a bit challenging. This passage does, however, speak of a time and a place to receive repayment, but it's not here and it's not now, it is later. Can we delay gratification, or does our thirst for self-recognition drive us to be satisfied now? In Luke 18, 9-14, I didn't put that up, but Luke 18, 9-14, we learn to lay aside self-assessment and depend on God's mercy. And Jesus draws this picture in that one. It's a picture of two men at prayer. And the first man begins his prayer with, "Thank you," but then it's as if he quickly tallies up score of his righteous deeds, how much better he is, how much more his deeds exceed that of other people. But the other man, he starts with God's mercy instead of self-assessment. Score-keeping and judgment belong to God. Let's be careful. If we have a measuring stick by which we measure and judge others, we may eventually be asked to be measured by that same stick. And the other side of that problem is our self-assessment causing us not to pursue the potential that we have in God with His Spirit at work in us. When we read these stories, it's easy to recognize the pride in the Pharisees. It's something that we read and we talk about a lot. But do we see it in ourselves? Are we willing to be honest with ourselves and ask God's Spirit to expose any pride that comes from within? It's interesting that there is something that we all can do to bring the grace of God into our lives, and that is we can humble ourselves. But the opposite is also true. Our pride can block the grace of God. I want you to think about that. Our pride can block the grace of God. For every teaching on what humility is, we know that the opposite stands true for what is pride. Pride has many faces, but it has the same aim: to make more of ourselves and less of God. It's at such times that we need to ask, what really is our motive? Why am I doing this? Why am I saying this? Why am I responding this way? What is my motive? It's a very good example of pride and humility in the life of a wicked king, whose story is told in 2 Kings and also in 2 Chronicles 33. And his name was Manasseh. And I remember reading about him, and it seemed as if there was no limit to his wickedness, and also his wickedness he used to influence others to follow in his way. And he refused to acknowledge God, he refused to obey God, he did all sorts of unimaginable wicked things. And so, I want you to imagine this situation. Here is Manasseh, and God uses Assyria to come and to overpower him and take him prisoner. And here's the picture. Here is the king with a hook in his nose, shackles around his body, and he's being led away. There are many people who God has humbled and still refuse to submit. And so as I read about this king, I remember suddenly coming across the end of his story, and I was so surprised, because this is what I read. In his distress, he sought the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. God was moved by his entreaty. God humbled him, and God was moved by his entreaty, and he brought him back to Jerusalem and brought him back to his kingdom. In this story of King Manasseh, we find hope. Hope for everyone who's ever wondered, could I possibly grab God's attention? Even after a long list of rebellious acts, we see that God is still speaking and still reaching out. Our sin is the very reason that God continues to seek us. But it's not just his love that reaches down. Remember, it's a humble heart that must reach up. God knows how to humble us. And in this story of Manasseh, we see there's a massive difference between being humbled by the Almighty and humbling yourself before him. God may arrange circumstances that bring us low in the eyes of others, but only we can lower ourselves before God. He can extend severe mercy to all sorts of situations, but we remain in control of our thoughts and our hearts. Our hearts can move God's heart. In this story, we read this astounding revelation. Our hearts can move God's heart. God is not impressed by human power. He's not impressed by wealth or wisdom, but he is impressed by the human heart. What's in your heart? When a man chooses repentance, remorse for sin in a way that they go, I am going to change my ways, then the Father listens, just like Manasseh. Our prayers never have more power than when we take our proper place of humility before him. And the wonderful side of this story is that our humble example can influence the generations to come. Manasseh had a grandson, and his name was Josiah. And this child, he sparked a nationwide revival. And I'd like to imagine that Josiah heard firsthand from his granddad the horrors of his rebellion, all that he had did wrong, and how he needed to humble himself. So he heard the horrors of rebellion and the grace of humility. Our life lessons can become the seed that springs up 30, 60, even 100-fold in the lives that follow us. In the Old Testament, we read that humility spared Manasseh's life. In the New Testament, we read, humility is the doorway to God's kingdom as we respond to what Jesus has done. The story of Manasseh, it illustrates the pathway to God's heart, and that is the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Humility was the way of life for Jesus, and it's no less the way of life for us. However, when we step down that way, when we step through the doorway, we must guard our hearts. When we receive God's truth and knowledge, we must watch that we don't become spiritually proud, full of arrogance, self-righteousness, labeling those who cannot see the truth as fools, thinking less of others because they're not of the same understanding. We are all at different places of understanding in our walk with Christ. And when we start making those judgments on others, we must be careful because we may have stepped back into enemy territory. Grace understands that merely knowing the truth is not enough. Along with our knowledge, we need to be grace-filled people. The problem with knowing it all is that we can have a tendency to judge. And even the Apostle Paul recognized this problem when he said, knowledge puffs up. Sometimes the most insightful people can come across as cold and uncaring. It's like if we stood before an oncologist who diagnosed cancer, but he misses that there's a human being standing in front of him. Insight is never enough. The line between insight, between knowledge and judgment, is drawn by grace. We know that pride harms us deeply. We can look at our own lives. We can look around at the destructive path when we seem to think that we know the best way. Is it any wonder that God resists the proud? It is true that our own worst enemy is when we allow pride to take the higher ground in our lives. It seems to me, as I think about the difference, when I think about the dark and the light, when we allow pride to have free rein in our life, it's like we're choosing self-harm. God's grace, the favor that we don't deserve, is essential to our spiritual lives. When we recognize pride making a stand in our lives, are we allowing pride to stand in the way of God's grace flowing? Let me say that again. When we choose pride in our lives, are we allowing it to stand in the way of God's grace flowing? Are there some things that we need to lay aside and humble ourselves? In our own lives, we each could imagine things that maybe we step up and we put in the way of God's work. We take the way of ungrace. Are there things that we need to lay aside to humble ourselves? In conclusion, a humble heart paves the way for greater grace. A prideful heart does the opposite. It's all about your heart. Which one describes your heart? As we come to this time singing this last song, I would love it that if I knew that God's Spirit was at work in you. You know, I think for me this is things that probably a lot of us know. It's an accountability call, and sometimes we need that. And my prayer is today that as you go out into the week, that when you notice that rise up in you, that you'll remember that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble.